Hello, and welcome to the GC80 Show. My name is Amanda Skofstad, Public Affairs Officer for the Episcopal Church. Today's guest is the Reverend Lydia Buckland, Canon to the Ordinary for Discipleship and Vitality in the Episcopal Diocese of Northern Michigan. I had the opportunity to sit down virtually with Lydia, she in her office in Upper Michigan, and I in the Episcopal Church's digital media team in our New York City studio. We talked about emerging innovations in how and where we do church, including the Wild Church project with which Lydia has been heavily involved. In a recent study conducted by the Episcopal Church, we learned that almost half of all Americans find being outdoors to be their most spiritually fulfilling activity. And in this interview, we explored the possibilities that arise when we worship in greater connection with nature. Let's take a look. Lydia Buckland, thank you for joining us today. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about your role in the Diocese of Upper Michigan?
Sure. I serve as the Canon to the Ordinary for Discipleship and Vitality, which is a very long title to say that I support and companion all of our congregations in areas that are life-giving and dreaming about what might be possible for the church. And so that might be around congregational redevelopment or growth or new church plants, even hospicing some communities sometimes. But looking at vitality kind of in this new way that goes beyond average Sunday attendance and really in terms of how lives are being transformed and how we can walk in God's footsteps out in our community.
Okay, so what is Wild Church exactly? Tell us a little bit about it. How it got started, like what gave rise to this taking shape, and how is it going now?
In the fall of 2019, Bishop Rayford and I were approached by Bishop Catherine Finnegan and her staff from the Northern Great Lakes Synod in the ELCA. So they're our partners in ministry here in the Upper Peninsula. And they said, we've got this opportunity to do ministry exploration, particularly around young adults. And we have some grant money. Would you like to partner with us? And so, meanwhile, at the same time, I had just moved back to town. So I grew up in the Upper Peninsula. I left for 20 years, was not going to return, and came back and spread my parents' ashes with my brothers and looked around really at the creation and the beauty and the land and said, this is a gorgeous place to be and to live and worship. And I think I want to come back. And so that's how I ended up back here. But I had a friend from high school who also came back in a similar way. And she and I were running into each other. And she said, I keep having all of these conversations with people we graduated with saying they were longing for faith community, but that the church that they used to go to didn't fit anymore.
Yeah.
And they were saying they connected in nature, they connected on walks, on hikes. And so we connected. Lanny Lonto is the name of the person that I went to high school with. So she was hired as the mission developer. So this is a joint ELCA and Episcopal ministry. Right. And she went around town and did 30 one-on-one interviews with other young adults, with young parents, with community members about their faith, about what they were looking for. And what we heard is that people were already connecting with God out in nature. They already knew about resurrection. They already knew about healing and about all of these things that we talk about in church, but they were experiencing along a waterfall or out in the deep forest, but they didn't have community to connect with because it felt weird to talk to their hiking friends about these spiritual experiences they were having. And then it felt weird in church to say, well, I saw God in the tree. They were nervous about that, right? The church was going to say, no, that's not how you can experience God. So there wasn't this place for the two things to merge. And so Lanny and I started exploring and we found the Wild Church Network, which is really a global movement that is happening all over, especially in the United States and Canada, where the way they word it is led by the love of Christ to invite people into intimate relationship with some of the most vulnerable victims of our destructive culture, the land, waters, and creatures with whom we share our homes. From isolation to connection, from detachment to immersion, from dualism to interbeing. Like wild mushrooms after a spring rain, wild church communities are responding to a call from deep within to change the way we relate to the natural world.
That's beautiful.
Isn't that beautiful?
Thank you.
Really resonated. It really resonated with us in terms of what we were hearing. And living in the Upper Peninsula, we're 30% of the land mass of Michigan, but 3% of the population.
Wow.
So our land really is wild with the Great Lakes and with the forests. And it was such a no-brainer that this would be something we'd be able to do. And so with the support from leaders of the Wild Church movement, we started our own UP Wild. It was funded through the ELCA, through a synodically authorized worshiping community. So a SOC, they call it. And new Episcopal church start. So we did church planting as a partnership between the ELCA and the Episcopal Church in order to fund the ministry.
So we did this study, the Episcopal Church. We asked more than 3,100 Americans about their spiritual practices and beliefs, what they think about Jesus and his role and relevance today. And what we found in that was that overwhelmingly Americans across the board were very much for the person of Jesus. There was a little more trouble on the front of whether his followers are aligning well with his teachings. But another one of the surprising findings was this emphasis, like you said, people finding God in nature. And so, like almost half of all Americans identified finding being outdoors in nature to be their most spiritually fulfilling practice, and prayer came after that. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like what's that about? What's going on right now that makes that a particularly fulfilling activity? Some people might say this is, COVID related because outside was safe, but it sounds to me like you were seeing a lot of this even before COVID. So I wonder how you think about those things and how they fit together.
Yeah, the need for UP Wild started before COVID. It was in 2019, really driven by people who were already articulating that they were connecting with God and with what they would call creator, which I think is interesting, is that they could name it. They could name the theology, but they wouldn't be one to participate in like Bible study, but they would talk about resurrection through dying trees and new sprigs of life. Right? They talk about healing through water, and they'd be up for water ceremonies, but like this idea of a performative baptism to attend felt a little off-putting with all the fancy clothes and showing up in your Sunday best. I think there's something about this redemptive quality of the rawness and why that's why I love that it's called wild, right? Because there's something about it is how God made it. It is, you can bring your full self and you can see God at work, and we are invited to be co-creators into that. I think where we are right now in terms of climate change, in terms of a collective of people recognizing the harm we've done to the earth and wanting to commit to live better, there's this intentionality of really going into nature. And some of the UP Wild services are like lamentation. They're prayerful apology and crying out for the harm we've done, for desecrating the land. The UP is a mining community. And there are areas of the UP where they had to move entire towns because the land was sinking. Like the houses were going to collapse because they extricated too much. And so that land now is like a state park. It's like marked as park, and you can walk through it. And so to do a prayer walk and to say together, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," to use the words of scripture in that place of saying, we've messed up and we have to commit together to do better. There's like an activism piece too, but it's also liturgical. I feel like the opportunities for being church in this way, it's formation, because we always, when we gather, talk about, so if we're like, we go to an area called Presque Isle in Marquette, and if we learn about the geology, the rocks that are there are like glacial rocks that have been there for billions of years. And so we name that the land that we're standing on is the land of the Anishinaabe, original indigenous folks who still live and move and have their being. So it's rooted in that truth. And then to say, and the rocks that we're on and the dragonflies flying by us are billions of years old, and like this sense of like the enormity of it. And then to enter into our own opportunity to walk and reflect and listen for God. And then we come together in circle to share what God said to us. So even, the reflection, the sermon is collective. So we're doing all of these like parts of a traditional service. There's some scripture, there's some poetry, there's some song if people are songwriters and want to engage in song. There's breaking bread, there's a feast. And, but it's in this very embodied, incarnate way that people feel. And I think they're just, I don't know if it's a generation, if it's because of all of how much the world is hurting, but there's just this need, I think, for people to actually live this theology in a way that's more than sitting in a pew and saying it. But maintaining the ritual, right? Like there's still a ritual, there's still a way and a pattern of gathering and being, but it's accessible. And for those who have been wounded by the institution, it feels safe. It feels safer.
So I'm really interested in what you were saying about how the forms of church, even the physicality of the space, can have different influence or weight on different people depending on their spiritual background. And I wonder if you could talk about other innovations in kind of shape-shifting church. I understand there was one project you were involved with that was like a brewery and a church collaborating on the topic of space. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that as it pertains to where and how we do church. We have great latitude and freedom, and it can be really important pastorally for people to have various kinds of forms.
Our most recent project has been with a little church in Ishpeming called Grace Episcopal Church, who, they had dwindled down to around 10 people, and they had this giant building, and they had a whole lot of costs associated with it. And they were feeling really scared about what they were going to do. And it so happened that there was a brewery in their alleyway behind them, kind of tucked under in like an old speakeasy type place. That needed more space. And the dream of the person who owned the brewery was Pub as the Hub, which is a movement happening in the UK, turning a pub back into a community center where people can like get career advice or connect with someone if they need someone to talk to, or like have like a food pantry. And so he was already thinking about these things, and he's this sweet retired electrician who's just well loved in the town, deep family roots, everyone trusted. And so I said, let's have a conversation together. What would it look like for us to partner? Because actually these are the dreams of the church too. And with all of your community partners, with all of our community partners, like we could do some big stuff here. And so what it ended up being the best solution was that we basically sold the church to him, the building of the church, for a very small amount, because he then has to take on, all of the costs associated with it. But he said, I'm not going to have the brewery open on Sunday mornings. Go ahead and meet. Go ahead. Let's do this together. You don't need to change where you're meeting. We'll be partners in this for as long as I own this place. And so, the space will change. The pews will come out, and it will be more movable in terms of being able to host events there and being able to have a tap room and use the space differently. But that place is as important to him in the community. And it is a place of gathering. And that community desperately needed that space. It's kind of a ghost town of a mining town. And there was no community center. Just recently, actually, a student in the middle school died by suicide at school.
Oh, dear.
And it was absolutely horrific. And the community needed a place to gather. And we now then had this center, this community center, where we could offer the space. And there's a text chain now going with like the mayor of the city and some of us from the church and some of us from the brewery, some tribal liaisons, all of us who just deeply care about a community wanting to partner. And so, it has completely shifted and transformed the ministry we're able to do, but also how we use the space for prayer and worship. And the leaders of like these community movements have been outside of church, but we're doing ministry together.
That's right. Wow.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you would like people to know if they hear this and they say, I have interest, this is speaking to my heart, like this is something I am feeling called into? How do people join the movement? How does it start? How does it work? Is it certain areas of the country, or like what are you seeing on that front, and how do you see that playing out over the next 5, 8, 10 years? Like what do you see down the road? So how do people get involved, and what do you imagine the future is here?
I think one of the coolest things about this movement is that there are so many opportunities for entry into it and ways we can do it. So either from a diocesan level or from a congregational level or as a new church start, it truly is very simple. I think what's exciting, I'm chairing the legislative committee for congregational and diocesan vitality. So we've been listening to voices around the church in terms of what is happening with vitality. And what we're finding and what we're hearing is that it's the things outside of the pews that are exciting people and that are connecting with people. Over and over again. It's the food pantries, and it's the garden walks, and it's the hikes, and it's, the Good News Gardens, and these fun revivals. It's all of the ways that we're going outside the walls and inviting people in, but also just being outside with people. And so I think the simplicity of like letting go of this idea of like an exceptional Episcopal parish, right? Letting go of this idea that like the Episcopal church and worship has to be this particular way, or it's not real, or it's not valid, or it's not good enough. And to say it actually should better match the local context in which we all find themselves. So for us in the Upper Peninsula, that's with our Indigenous siblings, that's with the land, that's with the water. For folks in other places, in inner city Detroit, that's going to look very different.
Right.
That's going to, and like the music should be reflective of it, the worship, like there's so many different opportunities. When we look at like what liturgy is, it's the work of the people. So when we reimagine how we want to be as church, if we just ask people, what connects with you? Where do you find meaning? When have you felt transformed by God? And how do we share that with other people? How do we co-create that space together? And then to try things out. I think it's the taking risks, I think little amounts of money, this stuff is not expensive. And most places will offer space, restaurants or parks, have little shelters to just gather and bring some snacks and host some conversation and offer some prayer is a very easy kind of low risk thing to do. And I really believe that God is working through all of these little iterations and creating something so much bigger that we can't even imagine. That the more we share these stories and connect with each other, the more we'll realize the impact that it's having. Because I think it's going to be these small cells. The presiding bishop has said it before. It's this small church movement is what's going to bring us back. It's a revolution, like a revolving back to early Christianity, to how we were created to be together as community. I think we've pivoted a bit to become, communities gathered around a minister, rather than ministering communities where everyone participates and everyone knows their gifts and everyone knows their worth. And so these little iterations of being church, out in the world in different ways allows everybody to participate, which then we feel more connected, and then we keep going, we invite other people.
Yeah.
Which is then evangelism in action. So I'm just so excited for the things I'm hearing in so many different diverse ways. It's not a formula. It's not about a program or a curriculum. It truly is listening to community and trying things out and just being together in love and vulnerability.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Lydia. We really appreciate all of your energy, and thank you for your great work in this area.
Oh, thanks, Amanda. So fun.
To find out more about Wild Church, visit wildchurchnetwork.com. And to learn more about the Episcopal Diocese of Northern Michigan, visit upepiscopal.org. Special thanks to our partners at Church Pension Group for making this show possible. I encourage you to learn more about our sponsor in the description and links that accompany this video.